how do you say motion for summary judgment in Spanish?
Right.
Things
Doesn't really
like
translate, right?
exactly. So having to explain the procedures and the substantive law in Spanish to them in a way that they can understand it can be a challenge sometimes, and put it in a way that they understand it. Because I mean, you can translate motion for summary judgment in the most literal sense, but even then, you say motion for summary judgment to an English speaker,
I don't know.
they don't know what the
I don't
hell
have a
that
clue.
is.
Welcome to Practical Law, a podcast designed to help law firm owners, practitioners, and the general public better understand and advocate for their rights. I'm Christopher Pratt, your host, and today in our first episode, we're going to be talking with a lawyer that works at my law firm, Pracht Injury Lawyers, Alejandro Guarin. Alejandro has a great story and is a Spanish-speaking attorney that's really opening our doors to representing a whole other community here in South Carolina. So, Alejandro, how you doing, man?
I'm good, man. Just very glad to be here. It's really cool that you're doing this.
I'm excited about the podcast, and we brought you on as our first guest because you work for me, so we can't screw it up. Or if I do a bad job, it's not going to hurt the podcast.
Yeah.
We're glad you're here, man.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Spanish-speaking lawyers, Spanish-speaking community, or outreach to that community. Tell us your story, like how you came to the States, where you grew up. I know you're a native of South America.
It's a very particular story on how I ended up over here, particularly in the upstate South Carolina. Obviously, like you said, I was born in Colombia. I was born in Barranquilla, Colombia, but because of my parents, I was kind of all over the place. My dad had this kind of adventurer spirit, so we kind of moved all over the place. I lived 2 years in Ecuador. Then we moved back to Colombia, and then we lived in Paraguay for almost 3 years before we came to the States. When we moved to the States, of all places, we moved to Anderson, South Carolina, which is not really where you would expect an immigrant to come directly to. But at the time, we had an aunt that was already living here, so we kind of stayed with her for some time. And, I guess when we talk about where home is, Anderson is really my home. That's kind of where
Sure.
I grew up. I went to T.L. Hanna High School, played soccer there, and I was lucky enough to be, I wasn't messy or anything, but I was good enough to get a scholarship to play for 2 years at Spartanburg Methodist, which is a junior college. And then once I realized that I wasn't going to turn into a professional soccer player, I transferred to USC, and I was just a regular student. I did 3 years there. I did take a victory lap for, one or two reasons while I was over there.
Sure, me too.
I was a political science major, and just like every political science major, we all aspired to become lawyers at some point. And I took the LSAT after undergrad a couple of times, and I didn't do too well. So I said, let's go make some money, let's go work. And I worked in consumer finance for about 4 to 5 years. The subprime lending industry, which is
It's glamorous, right?
it's keyword for high interest loans.
Right.
And what I came to realize during that time is that industry is more of a sales job, because essentially, you're selling these high interest loans to people. And I realized that, I wasn't a good salesman, and I was like, well, what the hell? Might as well go back to the original dream that I had and try to go to law school. Took the LSAT one more time, and I got not a great score, but a decent score. And luckily, I was able to get into Mercer down in Macon, Georgia, and I did well there. And I graduated, and I got a job at a defense firm in Atlanta, Swift Curry, where I worked for a little bit over a year. And then I ran into you.
That's it.
And then you offered me a job to come here, and I came back home, and me and my wife are in Greenville now, and enjoying it.
Yeah, man. So you've been with us a little over a year now. And, my vision when we met and we started talking, and I think we share this, was to really provide a top-down solution to Spanish-speaking folks, to where their whole experience, from the moment they call the office to when their case is resolved, they've got native Spanish speakers that they're dealing with at every level of their case. We've been doing that about a year now. I know it's a work in progress. We're trying to always improve it, but tell me your thoughts on that. Like, that vision, that experience for the client. What's it like for you kind of being in the trenches of that?
And it's kind of funny that you say that you see the vision of changing the client experience to make sure that, that they understand what representation that they're getting. And it's funny looking at it from my perspective, because when I deal with a Spanish speaking client, it's just like you talking to an English speaking client. Um, I don't see the difference, just because these are just, I don't want to say my people, but they're my people,
Right.
if that makes sense. They come from different countries, different cultures, even within those different countries. But at the end of the day, we're just speaking Spanish to each other the same way that you would speak in English to me. It's just a
Right.
regular conversation. So it's tough to kind of evaluate or analyze what the difference is,
Sure.
because I don't know the difference, just
Right.
because I just deal with them as regular people, which inherently I think that means that they're getting a better representation.
100%. And that's funny you say that, because I do see the difference, right? Because let's call it the old way. The way I did it before you came on board was initially, this is way back in the day, but initially I would hire a translator to come in. They would come in on a contract, like hourly basis, and they would translate for the client. Then as we grew, we moved a little beyond that, and we got to a point where we had fully bilingual staff, right? Paralegals, intake specialists, whatever. And then, of course, we've taken the final step and kind of closed the loop, and we've got the Spanish-speaking attorney. And what I remember is when you first came on and we had you meet with a couple Spanish-speaking clients, watching their reaction after having a conversation with you about their case, and you and I talking about it afterwards, it was just obvious to me that this was a better experience for them, that we were providing better service instantly, like immediately. So I definitely see the value in it from having that before and after perspective. And again, like you said, isn't the goal that we want to have interactions with all of our clients seamlessly? Like, you shouldn't tell a difference, right? It should be the same. So tell me about that as we talk about that. Like, what challenges do Spanish speaking clients face? Like, as a member of that community, what are they dealing with?
Uncertainty, I think that's probably the first thing that they deal with, because try to put yourself in the shoes of a Spanish speaking client. Uh, First, they have to find an attorney. And the real question is, how the hell do they do that? Whether it's a Google search, somebody that they know knows somebody, and how do they know that that specific person is the right attorney for them? And that goes back to what you said. Having a seamless conversation with them can probably ease their mind in ways that no other attorney can probably do it. There are also obstacles from the lawyer's perspective. It's and when we talk about legal systems, we're talking about the American legal system and how things work over here are not the same way that they work in Latin America. The legal systems are different. So having to explain how things work over here to them can sometimes be a challenge, in particularly explaining legalese to them in Spanish. And I always joke with some Spanish speaking friends. It's just kind of like, how do you say motion for summary judgment in Spanish?
Right.
Things
Doesn't really
like
translate, right?
exactly. So having to explain the procedures and the substantive law in Spanish to them in a way that they can understand it can be a challenge sometimes, and put it in a way that they understand it. Because you can translate motion for summary judgment in the most literal sense, but even then, you say motion for summary judgment to an English speaker,
I don't know.
they don't know what the
I don't
hell
have a
that
clue.
is. So
Right.
how do you go from the first layer is translating it to Spanish, but then the second layer is explaining to them what it means. So those are the challenges that a Spanish-speaking client really faces, not only from their perspective, from my perspective as well.
And so, that's a challenge you have to overcome, and it's difficult from your perspective, even as a Spanish-speaking lawyer. Now, you take that back and think about me, for example, who, limited Spanish, right? Trying to explain that through a Spanish-speaking staff member who's not a lawyer, right? And doesn't have the legal training, and maybe hasn't translated that legalese in their mind from English to Spanish, other than maybe literally, right? Which doesn't convey the meaning at all. Well, tell me this: what other things do folks out there who are wanting to, provide legal services to the Spanish-speaking community? What would we tell law firm owners and other practitioners when dealing with the Spanish-speaking community? What do they need to know?
I think really investment is probably the right thing to do in like you said, a top-down approach. Not only just a top-down approach, but a full service approach. And I'm talking about, from the attorney to the paralegal to the intake specialist. I know at least with us, we have Laura who does our intake and she's great. We have Angela and Eliza who provide the paralegal services in Spanish to give a peace of mind to the client, and of course me, I'm able to translate and provide the services in Spanish as well. So it's very key to make sure that every step of the way is consistent. It's not just one person speaks Spanish. It's everybody speaks Spanish, and that way, when I communicate to my paralegal what we want to tell the client, she not only knows what needs to be told, but the way and the form that it needs to be explained to them. So I think making that full investment is really important, because a lot of the times we talk about things getting lost in translation, and it's almost like playing this game of telephone between attorney, paralegal, intake, client, and all this other stuff. If you're able to streamline that whole message in Spanish, I think that really helps the process.
100% agree. I mean, it's hard enough to communicate. I know from my perspective, with my clients in English sometimes, and you get that game of telephone, right?
That's right.
So when you add a language barrier in there, it just creates a whole nother challenge.
Well, I think it's necessary. And in fact, we were talking about it a little bit earlier. We're actually in the middle of litigation in regards to that as it relates to insurance contracts.
Right,
Under
right.
the UM and UIM the UIM statute, they have to provide that selection and rejection form. And a question that we're bringing to the district court in federal court is whether that selection and rejection form should be presented in Spanish to somebody that doesn't speak English. So I think that's translatable to law firms, right? Because if the client doesn't know what they're signing, do you have a client?
Right.
That brings a huge question um, that we as lawyers should probably be able to answer.
Sure.
And so I think it's a huge step. Now, this is not to say that you shouldn't cater to the Hispanic community. Of course, you should, because it's a need that's there. But there need to be safeguards to make sure that the client understands what they're signing, the representation that they're getting. And I think really one of the most important parts is the scope of that representation. Make sure that the client doesn't think that you're their lawyer, but you're their lawyer for everything.
Everything, right? Immigration, whatever might come up.
And I
right?
get those questions all the time: is, can you represent me in this immigration matter? And I'm like, no, I don't do any immigration. I know some immigration lawyers, but no, I don't do immigration. So I think it's very important to do that. And like I said, it's very important to provide that need, but do it in the right way.
Yeah.
I think that's
Sure.
really what it comes down to.
So I woke up this morning and jumped on LinkedIn, and I saw a post you had written, and you put it up last night, and it was about a couple of your experiences representing Spanish speaking and just your interaction with our court system and litigation. Tell us about that.
And this goes back to what you were talking about, providing top-down services in all aspects of the litigation. Just earlier this week, I had a minor settlement hearing that had actually been rescheduled twice. And then we show up to court on Tuesday morning, and the interpreter just canceled last minute. And, the judge is talking to the clerk, trying to see if they can figure out a way, because, I could tell that he kind of felt bad that we had made it there, and we couldn't go forward with the hearing. And they went through three different interpreters who I suppose interpreted for the court, and none of them were available. Luckily, the client was available. We're going to have the hearing next week, but it's just part of the client experience. As a Hispanic client, it's just that it's not seamless like you were talking about earlier. So it's just having to reschedule. There's another experience several months ago, and this goes back to understanding the Hispanic clientele, is because sometimes people from more remote areas in Latin America, they may not dominate Spanish in the same way that they dominate their local dialect. so this particular client, he spoke Spanish and we could communicate very well, but he felt more comfortable speaking in his local dialect from when he was from. I believe he was from Guatemala, and you know, funny enough, when we were setting up or trying to set depositions, um, we found somebody, or this service told us that they found
They could
somebody
do it,
that
right?
spoke this specific dialect. So we were great. So we show up, and the interpreter, it was pretty obvious from the beginning that they were not communicating in the same wavelength.
Right,
And I
right.
didn't understand what was going on. And this kind of put me in the shoes that you sometimes may be in, not understanding what's going on and, hearing one question from the other attorney, and the interpreter goes into this long tangent. And
Right.
then the answer is like, yes,
That's absolutely. I've had that happen
So
multiple
it's,
times.
we got to a point. It's like, hey, something's going on here. He's not really translating what's going on, and we had to reschedule the deposition. I had driven 3 hours to get there. My client had to take the day off of work to be there. So that's time for me. That's money for my client that he
Sure.
loses the day of work, just because the resources aren't available to provide the proper representation from the top down, even to the interpreter level.
Sure.
So that's very important you know, to our clients, man. And it just really changes the experience for them.
It's fun. It's funny you say that because as I'm thinking about it, I think everything you said is spot on. But as I'm thinking about it, I question whether if I was the lawyer sitting in that deposition, not being a Spanish speaker, if I would have realized how poor the translation was going. I mean, and if the client could have communicated that to me, like, hey, I don't think this guy's faithfully translating my testimony, right? And so again, I just think it's another critical example of the value add that having a Spanish speaking attorney brings to the table. It just really opens up the avenues of communication. And I know we always say that like the way we make our cases better is by talking to our clients, right? And so it just seems to be the foundation of that.
Yeah, and in that post, I put some statistics there. According to the census, and this is on the SC courts. It's all over. It's all in there talking about the statistics as to the Hispanic population in South Carolina. And in the 2020 census, the population had grown from 6.6 to 7.5. Hispanic population, well, non-English speaking population in South Carolina, which is roughly 400,000 people in South Carolina. And according to the ABA, this is online, you can look it up, is that South Carolina has the lowest lawyer per capita in the whole country.
Right.
So you translate that to the non-English speaking population in South Carolina. I don't know what the numbers are. I'll admit that, but I'm assuming it's probably less than that. In fact, I'm actually kind of in the works with some other Spanish-speaking attorneys in South Carolina to try to start the Hispanic Bar Association in South Carolina. And we reached out to the South Carolina Bar, and they provided us a list of all the lawyers in South Carolina that identify as Hispanic. And
How many were there
139.
in the whole state?
And I was able to identify at least 20 that didn't even live in South Carolina.
Right.
So these are out-of-state attorneys. So you put that number, you may be looking at 120, 115 lawyers in South Carolina that identify as Hispanic. That doesn't mean that they speak Spanish.
That's true.
So
Yeah,
it's
right.
so you keep reducing that number down. And I don't know what the statistics are of those actual lawyers that are there, but it keeps reducing that statistic down on the number of people who can actually represent, Hispanic clients in the state. And what I think what the solution has become is have bilingual paralegals,
Right.
which is fine, and that's an excellent.
need
thing.
more of that, but-
Exactly, and it's an excellent thing to do. But you might be towing some ethical lines as to whether the paralegal can provide legal advice and all that
Right.
kind of stuff, or whether what she's providing is actually a translation. I don't know what the ethical rules specifically say about that, but kind of towing some lines there.
Yeah,
at least
sure.
in my opinion. So I think that's kind of going back to the post that I posted yesterday. That's kind of part of the struggle, and the need for, some sort of initiative. I don't know from who, maybe from ourselves, maybe from, starting in undergrad, starting at law schools with the courts, trying to recruit more interpreters. It's just, there probably needs to be some sort of initiatives in order to kind of move that forward.
Yeah, no doubt. So, kind of shifting gears a little bit, going back to the value that having a Spanish speaking lawyer has. I've oftentimes thought like, and I never really had like a multi-million dollar case with a Spanish speaking only client. I've had definitely a lot of six-figure cases we've settled, even I think some high six-figure cases, but never really, like a Samuel Hernandez would be an exception to that. That was a
Hmm.
workers' comp case, but never had that huge case without the aid of you, a Spanish speaking lawyer in my firm, right? And so I've often told you this. I think if I were at a law firm and we didn't have a Spanish speaking lawyer and we got in a whopper of a trucking case or maybe a dram shop case, I don't know, something with really big value, but I did not have a Spanish speaking lawyer. I think that there is tremendous value in associating a Spanish speaking lawyer, even for a small percentage of the fee, maybe, right? Maybe you don't do a 50-50 fee split, but you go in there and you say, hey, I'm gonna give you 20% of the fee, but I need you to be total client focused. And I need to make sure that this tremendous case, that there's nothing missed as far as the communication aspect and the client understanding of it. I know that's something you and I've talked about. Just kind of give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and when you talk about litigation and really making sure that you maximize the recovery for somebody, it's a matter of storytelling. Not only to the jury but also to the other side to let them know what the story is going to be if this case goes to trial, and that communication portion, whether not just with the person that was injured but the family members. You talk about grandma, mom, brother, sister, wife, sons, kids, all that kind of stuff. You got to be able to understand the story and understand the way the story needs to be told from their perspective, and not have any type of watered down version through a translator.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I think a lot of firms, and I understand this, and this is not a criticism, but they get this huge case and they say, wait a second, I don't want to pay 20% of my fee to some lawyer that I'm the great trial lawyer, right? That's why the case came to me. I want to try it on my own. But I think you're exactly right on the storytelling portion of it. I don't care how great of a trial lawyer you are, if you don't understand the minute details of the story and the familial relationships and where the harms and losses lie, I don't think you can do a great job advocating for them. And so, uh, yeah, I mean, I just think that's why it adds tremendous value.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Shifting gears again, where do you see the future as this? As you said, the Hispanic population in South Carolina is rising, right? What do you see the next 10, 15 years as far as this community grows and the legal representation they get? How do you see it panning out?
I think inherently, just kind of talking generationally, I think the Hispanic population just in the whole country has grown overall. And obviously, South Carolina is no exception. And what I think will probably happen is that we'll have more Hispanic lawyers, more Spanish speaking lawyers. At least I hope that's the case, and hopefully being able to have a legal field that really represents the population that we serve. Um, we're probably a long way from that, but at least we can improve it. Um, and I think that's going to be the changes. I don't want to say that I'm the savior in this whole thing and trying to push this thing forward, but at least I want to be part of it.
Sure.
Whether that's helping younger generations, having organizations that are able to reach out to the Hispanic community and let them know that we're here. We're not is lawyers aren't just this old white man in a suit. It's there's people like you that can do these things for you, and you can also become like us. That way you can serve your community as well. I think that's probably what the future holds. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't really know, but that's just kind of my prediction.
Let me ask this. So I've thought about this, and we haven't had the opportunity to take a Spanish-speaking client's case to trial in the last year you've been here. I hope we do that in 2025. Maybe we got a couple we should look at. How do you see? Just tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the presentation of that case when you have a client that doesn't speak English and you're going to have a jury that probably doesn't have a single Spanish speaking person on it. Odds are, right? So, like, I mean, I'm just thinking practically, right? Like we're in, I mean, practical law, right? So,
That's right.
so we're in trial, and you've got your client on direct, right? And obviously, you're having to use a translator. How would you do that? How would you want to most effectively communicate that to a jury?
That's interesting, and I think And like I said, I've had depositions where that's been the case, and I think the key, at least for me, this is what I think personally, is that breaking it down into pieces. Avoid the long-winded questions and kind of let them tell the story. And because obviously it goes from me, interpreter, witness, and put it in a way that help the interpreter tell that story that the witness is telling. And I think being concise with your questions and put them in a way that's clear and able, so the interpreter can convey that to the witness, and then the witness can convey that to the interpreter. That way, ultimately, the jury is able to understand that story. I think that's really the best way to do it. And obviously, and this should go without saying, as it is with any client, understand what the story is beforehand. That way,
Sure.
you can frame it in the way that you want, and that way, the witness becomes the star of the whole thing. I think that's really the best way to do it, and don't put it in a complicated way where the interpreter is suddenly, going all over the place, not being able to really translate things accurately. I think that's the best way to do it. It's certainly tough.
Yeah, it's a challenge we haven't like truly grappled with, but I just, I bring it up because I see it as being one of the hardest parts of having to um, try a case with a Spanish speaking client. I know David Yarborough and David Lale a while back had a big result for a young man that I think was a Spanish speaker. And so, it's one of the things it seems like to me, and maybe you get your opinion on this, is the interpreter itself. It seems like what we would want to do if we could swing this through the rules is get a court certified interpreter that we like, that understands and we feel real comfortable with on how they're going to present it. Because I mean, a lot of it's theater, right?
It's funny that you say that, because just a few months ago, I had a workers' comp deposition where I thought the interpreter was really good. And I told him, was like, hey, can I have your contact information? So I think he started maybe like pinpointing the people that you think is good, and kind of maybe using them more. I don't know exactly what the process would be with the court, but just making sure that, make the life of the interpreter easy so they can convey that message. I know exactly what case you're talking about, that Yarborough Applegate did, for the Hispanic client, and a big issue in that case was whether the immigration status was even relevant to that case.
Right.
It's no lie, we're in South Carolina. That significantly probably affects how a jury is going to view somebody,
Sure.
especially when we're talking about rural counties or more conservative counties, especially with the political landscape today. But using the procedural guidelines with motions limiting, things like that, to make sure that only the relevant stuff goes to the jury. Somebody's immigration status, how they got here, that's really, irrelevant,
So
because
how they were harmed, who's at fault,
that's
what their injuries are. I
that's
agree.
exactly right. And when I used to do defense work, in fact, that would sometimes go into the reports. It's like, hey, this is a non-English. If the insured was non-English speaking, we're like, hey, this is a non-English speaking insured. It's not going to go well in whatever rural county in Georgia. Maybe the value
Changes.
it
Yeah.
changes just based on that. So I think on our side, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're using the procedural measures to avoid the jury being tainted, but something that's really completely irrelevant.
Right.
Just because you're in this country without papers, or really whatever way you got in here, that shouldn't mean that somebody gets to injure you and diminish your value, the
No
value of your
accountability,
case.
right?
Exactly.
And that's the problem too. If we allow a certain class of people to get hurt without accountability, then it puts us all at risk.
That's right.
So, Alejandro, man, this has been a very informative and great conversation about serving the Spanish-speaking community. And I just thank you for taking the time. I know I'm giving you a lot of cases, a lot of work, coming over here and helping us knock out the kinks with episode 1 of Practical Law. But we're going to close out each episode of the podcast just kind of by talking about current events. So tell me what you think about the TikTok man.
Man, it's an interesting topic, and it's funny. It is funny because I actually listened to at least a portion of the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, and I think probably what the legislature did, or the way they framed the bill, or the law that was passed, was that they didn't really target TikTok. At least this is the way I interpreted the oral arguments. The way they presented is that they didn't really target TikTok per se, but they targeted is it ByteDance?
ByteDance, yeah, the parent company.
Yeah, they targeted ByteDance specifically, saying that they need to divest out of TikTok. And inherently, what that means is that they're targeting a foreign corporation. Therefore, they don't have any speech right or First Amendment speech rights in the United States. But then, obviously, TikTok came back. It was like, well, inherently, since they own us, whatever restrictions you put on them
happens to us.
Happens to us. So. I thought that was kind of interesting, the way they framed that and the way the law was passed, the way they framed it. I think it was kind of smart to kind of bypass the First Amendment issue. It was kind of funny because kind of what they were saying is that the speech that was being restricted was the algorithm, which,
is algorithm speech.
From a logical sense, is like, is that really speech? And I don't want to get political about the whole thing, whether they should ban it or not, but, it was kind of... It was kind of clever the way that they did it. And then obviously it was a 9-0 decision saying that the ban stands.
All right, so good talk about TikTok. I'm going to close this out with a simple yes or no question. 6 months from now, is there TikTok in the United States?
Oof. I want to say no. Unless Elon buys it, but
right. I'm going to say yes, because I think somebody will buy it. I think that they are going to cut some kind of a deal where a American company or interest takes over more than 50% and gets it out of ByteDance's hands. So I'm going to say yes. Alejandro, thank you again for taking time out of your day to come talk to us and get the first podcast. Hopefully this thing's a big success and you are the original guest, right? So thanks again, and thanks to everybody for joining us today on the Practical Law Podcast. You can find us anywhere where podcasts are reached: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, however you prefer to get our podcast. Please do. If you don't mind leaving us a good review on the podcast, we don't do ads, so this is the only way we can really get our name out there. And a good review, if you like what you've heard today, would do a lot to help us out. So this is Christopher Pratt signing off from the Practical Law Podcast, and we'll see you next time.